welcome to Blah Blah Comics, Blah Blah Curse Words. I'm Derek.
I'm Colby.
And we talk comics sometimes, and sometimes we talk comics creators, and sometimes comics creators collide.
Oh, yes, and today is the big one.
We've been teasing this for literally years, and we finally decided to put our metaphorical money where our metaphorical mouths are, and let's fucking do it.
Yeah, dude, we got
Grant Morrison
Alan Moore
versus Alan Moore.
Fuck yeah. You got the modern shaman facing the chaos magic master, bald versus the beard, the kind of masters of deconstruction and reconstruction to a degree. Finally come like modern day comic gods colliding.
I just realized, yes, they're both magicians, and holy shit, we're about to talk some shit on both of them. We're also going to talk them up, so
yeah.
Man, I'm really hoping that we don't finish this podcast cursed in some way. I mean, I'm saying if there's a non-zero possibility that will happen.
I'd hope not. You got a little quick background for people out there if you don't know who Grant Morrison or Alan Moore is. For one, I don't know why you're watching this episode. That's really weird.
Yeah, clearly you've never heard this podcast before.
Yeah. To Grant Morrison, I got stats here, man. He's 5'11". He's 57. Of course, born in Scotland. You got that beautiful accent. First published work was Gideon Stargrave in Near Miss in late 70s. Got on the other side, Alan Moore, 6'4". Bit of height advantage. It doesn't matter for shit in this fight, though. 63, Northampton, where he was born, the UK. He was really big in the underground fanzines before being published mostly in 2000 AD in Warrior. Also around a little bit earlier than Morrison, but still a very close time period. Of course, Moore made shockwaves through comics and changed comics forever with Watchmen. And Morrison has had a very subversive nature for several years in comics, slowly changing it. And today we'll talk about how probably just as much in weirder ways. But we've got some big questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounds a bit editorializing there about Moore, but then you balanced it out by talking about Morrison's impact as well.
Yes, well, speaking of impact, we got the first round here. And the first round...
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah, oh, I like the bell. First round is, who has had the bigger impact on pop culture?
And by pop culture, of course, you do mean the wider breadth of pop culture outside of comics. We're actually starting this feud, this battle, this game, looking at the world outside of comics in general.
Yeah, we're going to take a peek outside the box for a moment, because rarely is it that we have comic creators have this kind of impact on pop culture in such a visible way. But these people definitely have. You have, of course, Moore. I mentioned Watchmen earlier. Watchmen got the term... By no means did it invent the term graphic novel. By no means is that his creation. But got the term more popularized in pop culture. And got comics in general, from Watchmen just hitting stands. Watchmen being on New York Times bestsellers and New York Times must-read. You have, even to this day, V for Vendetta, the V-Masks, from Anonymous adopting that look to just protesters in general looking at a lot of the ideas and themes of superheroes that Alan Moore popularized and made a lot up himself and his wonderful weird head, have now become part of the superhero sphere, part of what we think of as a hero in general. And then you have Morrison. I mentioned the Subversion. You have Invisibles, who is basically the biggest inspiration for Matrix, which changed movies as we know it. You have books like Doom Patrol and Animal Man, which for a lot of writers and musicians changed the way that they viewed art in general, and went on to create crazy things outside of comics, but just to affect the world in general. So it's not going to be the easiest.
Yeah, so to start with, I think we have to mention the ubiquitousness of Alan Moore's name. When, for the last, 2017, so we're probably talking the last 30, maybe even 40 years, every Biff, Pow, Bam, Comics Aren't Just for Kids Anymore article has mentioned Alan Moore's name and Alan Moore's writing, and usually in conjunction with Watchmen, but occasionally with other projects, to the point where people who don't know comics often know the name Alan Moore. It's also been, mentioned on this and other podcasts on this network before that Watchmen is the only graphic novel to make Time's top 100 novels of the 20th century. It was number 86. that's not nothing. If we're talking purely on a level of exposure to the masses, then I think Alan Moore wins in a landslide, in a sweep. However, you do bring up a really good point. Morrison's influence has been more subtle, but potentially more invasive. The Invisibles is basically the storyboard for the Matrix. I mean, you could cut out the Invisibles and rearrange it and make the Matrix out of the storyboards. Supposedly, in one of the interviews for the Invisibles, Grant Morrison mentioned that he put a spell in the Invisibles to make it more popular and to inspire people's creativity. And I think I've told this story on the podcast before in a much older episode, possibly the Gaiman versus Morrison episode, but I want to reiterate it here. He talks about how a fan wrote him and told him that this was a gentleman, liked to cut up issues of the Invisibles and use the panels to tell his own stories. That story resonated with me because a friend of mine who was a huge Invisibles fan went to a comic store in Austin trying to find Invisibles issues, individual Invisibles issues. Too many I words. And that store had recently sold all their Invisibles comics to a young woman who was using them to basically cut up and storyboard her own story. So this was something that happened more than once to more than one person, that they were so inspired by the Invisibles that the only way they could express that inspiration was to take it apart and build their own stories with it. As you said, his earlier work, his earlier Vertigo stuff, Animal Man and Doom Patrol. I mean, if it weren't for Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, we wouldn't have Umbrella Academy.
Yeah, we wouldn't have Umbrella Academy. There's a lot of writers.
We probably wouldn't have Gerard Way.
In a lot of ways, we wouldn't have Gerard Way. Not only in comics, but musically, would be a drastic different approach because of how he approached it in a very comic manner and how he made music in a lot of ways, with the themes, every album being its own thing, telling a cohesive story, and of course, music being used as a theme for his comics in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's a hard fight for a lot of ways.
More so than that, one more thing I want to put in. I'm sorry, man. But you talked about Alan Moore's influence on superheroes, but I would personally argue, as far as superheroes go, Moore taught us how to deconstruct the superhero myth, and we'll talk about this further in the episode, but possibly to superheroes' lasting detriment. Whereas Grant Morrison, the reason we have a conception of the Justice League as the Justice League is Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison's JLA run put in the template for the Big Seven being the Justice League, which hadn't been the case for literally years up to the point when he did it. It was always, much like the Avengers, for a very long time, the Justice League was whoever didn't have their own book, because it was easier to coordinate a team if you didn't have to work around another book schedule. So Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, so many of these characters that that are cornerstones of the DC universe were not on the Justice League, but Grant Morrison wasn't having it. He wanted the Justice League to be the biggest, most important team in comics, so he built it out of the Big Seven heroes of the DC universe, and plus or minus a few members here and there, but that's the core of the team, and that has been the core of the team ever since. That became plus or minus a member the core of the team for the New 52 reboot. It's the core of the team building the DC cinematic universe. And that all comes down to Morrison saying, no, this is important. This is why superheroes matter. So, yes, Watchmen got a movie, and Watchmen is very directly based, on a work, more or less original work by Alan Moore. But the conception of the DC universe we have today, a lot of that can be put at the feet of Grant Morrison.
No, it truly can. I think, and again, very shortly we'll talk more about that. For me, what I'm hung up on, and again, if we're talking about pop culture in general, not just comics, the big ones for me, you mentioned it earlier, the fact that Alan Moore is always the one brought up when you are talking about comics on a news show, on TV, on 60 Minutes. Names like his are always going to be brought up. You also have, if we're talking about pop culture, and no, he's not the first to do it, but because of V for Vendetta, it definitely popularized it and gave movements like Anonymous and others, and Love or Hate the Movie, that too gave a lot of protest to this idea. So that mask alone is now part of pop culture in a way that it would not be.
It's part of the iconography of pop culture, yes.
In a way that it was never necessarily intended for, and especially the Guy Fawkes match before Alan Moore, what Guy Fawkes represented, and after is very different to especially America.
Right,
And
absolutely, yeah.
so for me, if we're talking pop culture, not comics culture, just pop culture in general, I do feel we kind of have to give it to Moore because of that alone, because of how...
Yeah, I feel like Moore has the slight edge on that just because, like you say, it's the ubiquity of the name and the ubiquity of the symbology. And that's not, and again, I don't want to disservice Grant Morrison's impacts on pulp culture for sure, but ultimately, if, like you say, if we take comics out of the equation, if it's purely what your mom, dad, and grandma have seen on TV or have heard through advertisements or have read in 30 years of news coverage about the medium, Alan Moore.
Yeah, I think that's because as much as Grant Morrison has influenced a lot of creatives and has influenced a lot of people who rose up and became huge in pop culture. We're talking about him, and yes, his influence is part of him, but we're talking about him as a name. Yeah, you very rarely... It's possible to see his name brought up on a news channel. It's possible to see it brought up, but not so much. And for what Watchmen has done, and the V-Mask and other things, Alan Moore is... When people think of comics in pop culture, he's one of the few writers they can name.
Right.
So for that reason alone, I think you have to.
Yeah, I'm comfortable giving round 1 to Alan Moore.
There we go. Round 1, Mr. Moore, he gets it. But round 2.
All right.
Round 2 is a much different fight. It is amongst their storied careers, very prolific writers, who has a more diverse catalog.
See, this one, I feel like I'm just going to get out in front and say that Grant Morrison has done so much. There's so much variety to his work. I feel like Moore... Oh God, I don't want to say one trick pony because that's devaluing so much of what he's done.
I think
as a creator, but he very much has a style. He has a set of stories that he wants to tell and a set of ways he wants to tell them. Whereas I feel like Morrison really does like to branch out. I mean, as big as he is into superheroes and as big as he is into his ultimate theme of heroism and good and love will defeat entropy and bad and evil, which is a very Jack Kirby thematic taste as well. Alan Moore, I feel, does... You know, his work tends to stay in a certain kind of... Oh God, again, I don't want to say bubble. Help me out here, man.
Well,
I'm going to shut up. You talk for a minute.
I will say, I mean, there are a few stories. There's like Small Killings and some of his 90s work that do feel a bit different, but he definitely has some tropes and some story elements that he falls back on a lot. And it adds a very cool through line to a lot of his work. And it adds something very special to his work, and that's what brought him to the dance. But... because of how his career went, and because of the impact of Watchmen, especially Watchmen, and other books, I don't think he ever... Where Morrison has different periods in his art, he has different periods in his writing, he has different ideas that he explored through different years. I mean, you have a book like The Filth and All-Star Superman, which are, you know, if you just put them up together, are staggering and very vastly different. You have books like Happy and Klaus, and basically every issue of Multiversity that almost works on their own, yet all still feel Morrison, but don't quite feel like he is just reusing the idea he used from years ago. Or if he is reusing an idea, typically it has evolved to become something different, where I do feel more... Maybe because of that impact he had on pop culture, was never allotted the freedom to really explore the weird corners in the spotlight. Right. So I'm kind of with you on that, where he...
Let me say something about Alan Moore.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, yeah.
No, you first.
Well, all I was gonna say is, Alan Moore really, a book from Alan Moore from 1989 and a comic from Alan Moore in 2009 aren't that different as far as the ideas and what they're doing.
Aren't radically different.
Yeah, you can pick them up and you can tell they're the same person. You can tell that one may be worse, one may be better. But at the end of the day, they're dealing with stuff. If you do the same thing with Grant Morrison, and especially the amount of stuff he has released, again, I mean, just like Joe the Barbarian versus Sea Guy versus Kill Your Boyfriend versus
Nameless.
Yeah, versus Nameless and Annihilator. Throw Filth back up there. Throw New X-Men in there. JLA. They all are so, or Batman run. They're all so varied and different in what they are doing. And yes, you can still tell it's Morrison, but that's not in a bad way. You very rarely feel, oh, this is Morrison.
He feels like he's constantly learning and moving forward.
Yes, very much so.
And I think you really hit the nail on the head. You said that possibly because of the impact he had on pop culture, possibly because of Watchmen, Alan Moore never really got the chance to grow the way Morrison has. And I think that's a really fascinating look at Alan Moore's post-Watchmen career. But I do have something I want to say about Alan Moore. I feel like it's going to come off as insulting, and I definitely don't mean it that way. The best thing about Alan Moore's truest gift is to look at an existing property and be like, yeah, but what if this?
Yeah.
I mean, my absolute favorite two Alan Moore projects are Supreme and Swamp Thing. And both of them are Alan Moore looking at a property, especially Swamp Thing, and being like, yeah, but wouldn't it be cool if it weren't actually a dude? And then taking that concept, to its logical conclusion. Supreme. Oh, so this is a Superman knockoff. Well, what if we actually treated it as we took the history of Superman and applied it to this random Superman knockoff character. Wildcats. Okay, so this is the plot of Wildcats. Well, what if the war's already been over for hundreds of years and this little outpost had no idea? Fucking Watchmen.
Yeah.
Okay, so what if we took these Carlton characters and took them to their natural conclusion? What if we put these superheroes in the real world? His gift is looking at something and saying, what if? Where I feel like Grant Morrison is just more like, look at the stars. Holy shit, you guys! And then just running off in a completely different direction than anybody would have thought to go. There's something to be said for the formalism of Alan Moore versus the, again, to use that word, chaos of Grant Morrison. And I think this is going to be more of a personal vote for you and I both. But I know you and I both definitely fall on the side of, for the most part, I am a big fan of Tom King so much because he is such a formalistic writer. But I tend to give the tip of the hat towards chaos more than I do formalism. Again, this is not a knock against Alan Moore. I think the reason Alan Moore has been so successful and remains so successful is because he has such a keen eye for story and plot, and to look at something and say, yes, but if you turn it 13 degrees, it becomes this entire new thing. And that's awesome. But I don't think it stands up to the constant growth and maturation and development that Morrison has been able to cultivate without the cult of personality that Moore never wanted in the first place, and yet still, unfortunately, was saddled with and had to deal with.
No, yes, I agree entirely with that. I think Moore is, you hit it great there, where Moore takes an idea and does a what if like nobody else and transforms it into something different, or takes it and
completely changes the property in the long run.
Where I think Morrison has proven a lot that when he does a similar thing, he has always found a way more to evolve it than just change it. He seems to...
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, he seems to take it more... Instead of taking it to a logical conclusion, he tries to expand it where it has more possibilities of different conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, I really don't want to make a fight short by any means, but I do think we're talking about diverse. I think there's a reason why people continually go back to so many different Morrison stories, because we're more... Even the biggest Moore fans, I think, will admit you have about 10 stories that are consistently worth revisiting to go back to.
Or 10 runs.
Yes, or 10 runs. Whereas Morrison, depending on who you ask, you can have vastly different answers.
Yeah, this is a weird comparison to make, but you saying that just made me think of back in the heyday of Bruce Campbell's popularity. Say when he was he'd do signings for like Xena Warrior Princess or something.
Yeah.
And he used to love to look out at his line because he'd see little kids dressed up as cowboys and they're there to see him for Briscoe County Juniors, and then he'd also see like 20, 30-year-old goth kids holding Evil Dead 2 VHSs that they wanted him to sign, and he loved that. His fan base was so, diverse and his career had been so interesting and different that he attracted this level of fans. And I kind of feel like that can also apply to Grant Morrison because, if you see Grant Morrison in a signing, there are people there dressed like King Mob, but there are also people there dressed like Superman, and they're equally excited to meet this guy.
Yeah, I entirely agree. I think he's represented so many different things to so many different people where, if it's fair or not, Moore typically represents one of two things to a lot of people.
Right.
And I think a lot of it has to do with the work. It's because, I said earlier, and because the more research we did, the more I do see that, where, much like George Lucas and Star Wars, I think the impact of Watchmen was so unpredictable and so unprecedented that Moore could never escape its shadow in that same industry.
We were denied the writer that Alan Moore would have been if Watchmen hadn't hit the way it did.
Exactly. I think he is someone who he would have, if Watchmen would have done Swamp Thing numbers and had that same kind of impact, that would have been amazing, and we probably would have had a Moore that had a career similar to Morrison, where he just continued to get bigger, crazier, and have different moments in his career that represented different things. But because people were expecting a certain thing from him, he constantly either wanted to deliver something completely else or wanted to try to prove them wrong. But both things are such a reaction to one single project you worked on that you're never going to be able to escape it. So I think for that reason alone, Morrison has to have the more diverse catalog. And
I accept that.
And on top of that, Moore had some long breaks and stuff. Morrison has very rarely had a long break where he didn't do something. I mean, even now where he hasn't had.
And he did take a break. He took a break post Happy for a while, and then he came back and put out like 4 projects in 2 years.
Yeah,
5 projects in 2 years.
And even
now,
they
were each different things.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You mentioned you had Happy, that was Happy and Batman Inc. That when Batman Inc. was wrapping up, and Happy, and then you had a kind of a lull for just a minute, but then out of nowhere, it's like Multiversity, Annihilator, Nameless, Klaus, and just boom, 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 and then
and the Wonder Woman, Wonder Woman graphic novel, which is basically why he took the 2-year break, because he read the entire catalog of feminist literature in order to properly write Wonder Woman.
Yep, and then takes over Heavy Metal, and even while writing Heavy Metal, he's working on the second volume of that, and working on 4 or 5 different other comics. So he's just a powerhouse and a workhorse, and because of that, he has so many different projects. That's why, luckily, me and you have read a lot of Morrison before this fight. We've made no hidden fact about our love of Morrison or more before this. But when it came down to it, we have already read so much Morrison, and yet there's still so much more to read. And more, I think we both got a point to where it's like, okay, we've read basically every more you have to read, and it wouldn't be that much more to read basically every more.
Right, exactly.
So yeah,
I regret that I didn't get to read his Judge Anderson work.
Yeah,
I have a copy of Skiz that I still haven't read yet. But yeah, it feels like there's like little bits and pieces, crumbs here and there of more work that I would like to pick up. But you're right, it doesn't feel essential. Like, I still have 2 volumes of Zenith left to read. Holy shit, why haven't I not finished that yet? The second volume of Sea Guy is out there somewhere that's floating around. I still haven't had a chance to touch. I want to reread his Batman run, because his Batman run ended up being so transformative and important to the character.
Yeah.
I do want to reread Swamp Thing, though. I love Swamp Thing.
No, Swamp Thing is great. I think Swamp Thing, still holds up constantly.
Yeah, it's crazy how well that book has aged and matured. That is, like, to me, honestly, and don't get me wrong, I am a big fan of Watchmen. Watchmen broke my brain at 16, just like it did everybody else's. But I feel like Swamp Thing is going to end up being the more mature, definitive Alan Moore work. The one that holds up, not just to criticism, because Watchmen's basically criticism proof at this point.
Yeah.
But I think Swamp Thing is ultimately the better, stronger work.
I think so too. I honestly
don't at me.
I agree. I do. I think Watchmen is incredible and amazing. But I think Swamp Thing, from beginning to end is just, it's so great. And it's a book where you can go back, and Watchmen you can go back to several times and read and relearn stuff. I think Swamp Thing can have a more personal connection and a more personal touch to a person.
Yeah, again, full disclosure for people who are checking out this podcast who have not really dove into our back catalog of blah blahs. The Anatomy Lesson is seriously like my second or third favorite comic ever written, period.
Oh, it's great. Well, we just talked about their catalog and their stuff, so the logical next question, talking about those catalogs, where you have Morrison for decades doing this of just constantly hitting, but more having probably the biggest, the biggest hit and biggest nuclear bomb, if you will, of comics in the past. Well, comics today, even. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask, who has had the biggest impact in comics?
And this one is going to be such a squeaker because Watchmen is the 500-pound gorilla, and Watchmen is critic-proof. And Watchmen, again, we mentioned it earlier in the show, Watchmen kind of broke comics.
Yeah.
The deconstructionist attitude of Watchmen and the response to the deconstructionist attitude of Watchmen, admittedly in addition to the deconstructionist attitude of the Dark Knight Returns. I mean, we've got to give Miller his nod in this particular show.
They're the reason why the first Comics Collision, so people out there, if you haven't watched it, go back, is Alan Moore versus Frank Miller.
Right,
basically
exactly.
Because of those two books.
Because of those two books. But Watchmen is the reason 90s comics have the reputation 90s comics do, because comics creators internalized all the wrong messages about deconstructing superheroes and the response of deconstructing superheroes that came out of Watchmen, and kind of it destroyed the superhero mythos in a way that is inescapable and is a huge impact. And if we're just asking pure impact on comics, if we're not talking about positive or negative, we're just talking about the pure level of impact, I don't think you can argue that Watchmen doesn't walk away with that, in a sweep. Yeah. As much as I want to say that the positive impact on comics that comes from Grant Morrison's work, that comes from Grant Morrison's JLA, you can't put that up against Watchmen.
I think what I was about to, my only counter to that, really, and it's an interesting counter because you mentioned the deconstruction attitude, and somewhere around the jail when Morrison started doing JLA and what he did with New X-Men and Batman and Future On, that reconstructionist attitude that Morrison had of putting it back together in a new way, all leading up to the point where, honestly, the more we've talked about it on Blah Blah Weekly, the DC universe right now is essentially the house that Morrison rebuilt.
That's entirely true, and unfortunately, and it's so interesting. I was about to say unfortunately, but unfortunately is not the right word. It's fascinating to me that Jeff Johns, who is so clearly a Moore disciple, to the point where he has been accused of basically ripping off Alan Moore his entire life, Jeff Johns did an about-face with Rebirth and was like, "No, this is better." And the Rebirth is absolutely, I'm so sorry. Rebirth is absolutely a response to the Morrison take on comics, and like you say, the reconstruction. Rebirth is the house that Morrison rebuilt. I love that sentence. That should be the tagline of this episode because that is so entirely true. And yeah, it is. That's great, but it's also it's still so fresh. We can look back and definitively look at the 90s and see the destruction, and I hate to use that word, but the destruction that Watchmen's popularity brought to comics. And I don't know if we've actually fully seen the impact of the Reconstructionist era. And it's not just Grant Morrison. Kurt Busiek has been trying to do this for literally decades. Mark Waid has been trying to do this since the 90s. People have been working towards Reconstruction for years, and it's finally starting. That trend is finally starting to really take hold and turn around in the best and most positive ways. And a lot of that you can, again, lay at the feet of Grant Morrison. That's why I feel like this fight is going to be such a squeaker. No matter who wins, it's going to be, are we looking at the old? Are we looking at that level of impact, that neutron bomb, as you and I have both described it, that Watchmen laid waste to comics? Or do we embrace the hope of the modern and the potential hope of the future and the Reconstructionist era, and Aquaman once again proposing to Mira, and Superman and Lois Lane having a child that they're raising right, and Superdad being the Superman that the world needs right now? Which do we, ultimately, how do you tip that scale?
Yeah, well, it's true.
I'm legitimately asking how do we tip that scale? Because one of them is a provable impact because you have the crater. You have the crater that Watchmen left. The other one is still in the process of being rebuilt, and there's joy and hope for the future. But I mean, dude, we've got fucking Doomsday Clock in less than a month. Is that going to break it? Is that going to bring us back down? Is that more Shadow once again overcoming Morrison's Reconstructionist light?
Well, it's a good point, because the fact that Doomsday Clock alone is as big as it is could be the answer. I mean, the fact that just writing a decent version of a nod to the Hat of Watchmen that will be followed by a big, basically Watchmen 2.0, that is as big, as anticipated, as clamored for, that might be the answer. Because you mentioned it, whether good or bad, that is, either one is an impact. And if we're asking who had the biggest impact in comics,
and I wanted to give this to Morrison, but the more I think about it, you can't escape Watchmen's shadow. I mean, look at the sales figures for Multiversity versus the pre-sale numbers for Doomsday Clock.
Well, and I mean,
I hate to say that, because again, I thought Morrison could actually walk away with this one, but Watchmen, you can't escape the crater that Watchmen created.
Because and
I keep saying crater, and it sounds so terrible.
Well, we're just talking about Watchmen too, without even talking about the ramifications for the better and whatever that his Swamp Thing run had, that V for Vendetta had, what he did for 2000 AD. Mean, there is a lot that he did, and again, that's not even talking about the big one, Watchmen. And yes, Morrison has had so many things that have had. Again, this fight is more and more coming down to it is that subversion versus outright in your face. This is.
Well, I mean, you talk about rebuilding. Grant Morrison completely rebuilt Batman from the Dark Knight Returns Batman to no, look, it all happened. All the silly shit from the 1950s you guys like to ignore. Adam West, all that stuff that all you whiny crybaby fanboys who can't embrace, Batman as a near murdering vengeance demon of the night. All of that happened too, and not only is it fine, it's super fucking cool. And finally, I think that was one thing about Scott Snyder's run that I ultimately really appreciated, was that he took that statement and was like, yeah, it is actually pretty cool. But again, even that, and you know how much I adore Grant Morrison's Batman run.
Oh yeah.
Even against that, you can't put that up against Watchmen. Watchmen is going to topple it. Watchmen is this giant fucking homunculus. It's the golem. It's the albatross around Alan Moore's neck. It's the golem of the comic book industry. And like I said, if we weren't on I think this fight would go differently if we weren't on the verge of Doomsday Clock. But you've seen the response to the potential of Doomsday Clock. We haven't even seen the first issue yet. But the response to the potential of another Watchmen-esque series, something doing Watchmen right. I mean, just taking fucking Before Watchmen out of the equation and just looking at before, the Doomsday Clock. You can't ignore Watchmen and what it means. And god damn it, I hate that I have to say this, but I think Moore takes this one.
And I hate to kind of agree on that, but I do think there's a lot of ways that's true, because no matter how many times Morrison rebuilt Justice League, rebuilt Batman, and to a degree, no matter how Marvel responded,
rebuilt the multiverse,
rebuilt X-Men, rebuilt several things to a point that even decades later, people will go back and go like, okay, this was the right way to go. Made Doom
Patrol, the Fourth World.
Yeah, made Doom Patrol and Animal Man into viable characters that became cult classics. No matter how many times you do that, Watchmen was just.
Someone just has to say, "Hey, we're doing something with Watchmen characters," and the internet and comics, shits its pants.
Yeah, it's true. So
it's unavoidable. God damn it, Moore takes this one.
Yeah, as much as I hate to go back to Watchmen, that's that is what happens over and over again when you come to more. Is it's impossible not. Yeah,
we have to be subjective.
And that inevitable fight of Watchmen is going to be there because Watchmen is what that is. It's whatever you want it to be. It's, the Beatles of comics, where it will be, no matter what you compare it to, it's like, well, you got to compare it to this because that's what it is. Well,
that's such a great comparison because there's another podcaster, Graham McMillan, on the Wait Well podcast, and he said something before that really sticks with me is, especially if you're not British, you'll never, and if you're not from that time, if you're not born in the 50s, you can't understand the world pre-Beatles. And for us, I was born pre-Watchmen, but I wasn't exposed to comics or pop culture pre-Watchmen, and I know you were born post-Watchmen. So yeah. we can't talk about comics really pre-Watchmen. And it is the Beatles of comics. It is the inescapable, again, the homunculus, the inescapable artifact, the fucking obelisk from 2001 landing in the desert and all the monkeys pounding on it with bone. It's inescapable. You can't. So, yeah.
No, it's true. It's true. Well, this is a fight that Watchmen won't actually help a ton in, and we have to focus more about what Moore brought to comics outside of Watchmen and what he did for comics in a very specific way, but which of these two people has had a more important history and who has been more important for the evolution of comic characters?
And I really, really like this question because the immediate knee-jerk reaction is to point to Swamp Thing and be like, case closed. But I don't think that's the case because, as I just argued, Grant Morrison made Batman. Yeah, well, he took Batman away from Frank Miller and was like, no, it's all of these guys.
I think, all the arguments we just said for Morrison that lost to Watchmen, I think, is what overcomes it in this fight because if he rebuilt JLA, rebuilt X-Men, rebuilt Batman, rebuilt Doom Patrol, rebuilt Animal Man, rebuilt the multiverse, built up Wonder Woman again in this current age, has built up his own franchises from Invisibles and Filth and Sea-Guy and everything else, but has also, for talking
Let's be fair, rebuilt Superman. Honestly, between All-Star and the first 18 issues of the New 52 Action Comics, he redefined Superman again.
We haven't even talked about All-Star Superman, and that is, I think you ask 99 out of 100 people, and they will all say, if they're comics people, will say All-Star Superman is, even 100 Superman fans, I think 99 out of them will say All-Star Superman is the greatest Superman story of all time.
I don't know if you get 99, but you'll definitely get in the high 80s.
You're going to get
some people are going to point to whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow or For the Man Who Has Everything, which is fine. But those are both one-off stories that are told well. They're not definitive takes on a character that completely encompass who this person is in 12 issues.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I love For the Man Who Has Everything. I think it's a really fantastic story that shows Superman's vulnerability in a way that we hadn't seen up to that point. I think Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow is a very strong what-if story, but All-Star Superman literally lays out Superman as a character over 12 issues and tells you who he is as a person in a way that those other stories just don't and can't. Supreme is a really great Superman story, and Supreme comes close to that, but it's nothing can touch All-Star Superman for defining a character. And I think All-Star Superman is stronger than Swamp Thing in that area.
Well, I think the other one I can think of for that, you of course have Killing Joke, with a very definitive, if not the definitive story for Joker. But even then, you do have to recognize Morrison's Arkham Asylum for being, if not tied, a very close second for really defining the idea of super sanity and adding a whole different layer to Joker and an evolution of the character that no one had really seen, and that especially in today's world of comics and movies and TV shows is being played with a ton.
Right. And again, to kind of crib off your note sheet here, despite the fact that Marvel desperately wants to pretend it never happened, Grant Morrison did something new with the X-Men. Holy shit, somebody did something non-Claremontian with the X-Men, and it worked, and it was good.
Yeah.
That's impossible. That shouldn't happen. I mean, the next best thing that happened after that was Joss Whedon being like, no, seriously, all this Chris Claremont stuff is really great. You just have to play with it like this. And everyone was like, oh yeah, that totally works too. So I mean, they're the two opposite ends of a scale. On the one end, you've got New X-Men. On the other hand, you have Astonishing X-Men, and everyone else kind of, except Claremont, of course, falls kind of somewhere on that scale. But you can't deny the quality of storytelling and the fact that he did do something new and exciting and brave with this staid franchise that was almost purposely trapped in its own amber.
Even books like Seven Soldiers, adding meaning to characters that before literally had almost no purpose in the DC universe for decades outside of they existed at this point in time and did one or two things important.
Right.
And seeing characters from those books go on to become very important. And yes, so I'm not saying they had no meaning. Let me rephrase it. They had meaning before, but afterwards seeing a renaissance in a lot of their ways and of him basically laying the blueprint for a lot of people to say, this is how this character can be written. If you want to follow this is a successful way.
Right.
Seeing how he kind of brought Darkseid back to that Kirby-esque villain with his idea. We talked about.
Well, like I said, Grant Morrison is the only person on this planet to outside of what Tom King's currently doing in Mr. Miracle, and possibly Walter Simonson's Orion run, to look at Jack Kirby's Fourth World and be like, no, guys, this is what he was trying to do. Yeah. Honestly, I've never seen somebody other than those two standout examples.
I'll throw the Allreds in there for Bug.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll allow it.
But even then,
but
that's
still,
four
even
people.
Then, that's so many years later.
Yeah. I mean, there's so... This fight, and I don't mean this to sound one-sided, but I do think, in my head, we made so many arguments previously in the last fight for this one without even thinking about it, honestly. It's because of that. Morrison has done so, because he has such a love for comic books and the characters in comic books, that he has purposely tried to expand them and bring them to a new place to where people can take them even higher and higher. And
he loves adding to the toy box.
He does. Or Morris, more and more... A lot of his best stories are in-game stories, like Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. They are, or even Swamp Thing, where they have the Killing Joke. They are final stories or add a final meaning. Because even Swamp Thing, though it is an incredible, we just said, probably his best work altogether, it doesn't add a ton for people that came afterwards. It left people afterwards in a bit of a, like, well, what do we do?
And boy, did they try, because I've read those post-More Swamp Thing issues, and they're tragic. They're trying so hard to keep up, and they can't. I think it's so funny you say that, because also another property we really haven't talked about at all, but very much falls under that scope, is Miracle Man.
Yeah.
He told the definitive Miracle Man story, and at the end of it, he more or less blew up the world. I mean, he really is. You're absolutely right. He's great at writing endings, which at the time comics didn't have, and that was very unique and inventive and cool. But you're right. It's not additive. So if what we're asking is who has added more, who has brought more to the evolution of these characters who are always in a perpetual second act, Alan Moore brought so many of them to a beautiful, wonderful, complex, and moving close. But Morrison understands that he's not the last person. To me, it's almost like Alan Moore is almost John Byrne in this situation. John Byrne, especially in, like, say, his Fantastic Four run, and to a certain extent in his Superman run, was trying to set things in stone. You know, he when he made Frankie Ray the Nova, the Herald of Galactus, there's a very specific line about how and Galactus will never need another Herald again. You know, the Skrulls lose their shape-changing powers. Well, the Skrulls can never change form again. The way Superman flies is described in his run of Superman, and that is supposed to be the definitive explanation of how Superman flies. These are all, you know, John Byrne really tried to put stones. You really set something in stone and make it, you know, this was my contribution. And to me, Alan Moore is almost that same way of, this is how this story would end. And there's beauty to that, and there's a wonderful story that could be told there. But there's also, I guess, a misunderstanding of how especially long-form narrative superhero comics work, in that, no, it's really not, because it can't be, because there will never be an ending. And Morrison really embraces that and is like, you know, again, it's his thematic. I think it ties into his thematic overarching story, which is we can defeat entropy. Entropy doesn't have to be this terrifying unknown. It can be something else. It's something that we can defeat with love and good and superheroes. Superman is better than the bomb. Superman is better than entropy. Superheroes will outlast all of us, and that's not only okay, that is awesome.
No, yeah, I can't say it better, I think. Morrison.
Sorry, I kind of went off on a philosophical tangent there.
That's fine. It's all very true and all very accurate. When it comes to evolution of comic characters, where they are, I also don't think more, especially today's more, I could think he could care less about where comic characters are.
Right.
So I think,
and again, that's partially due to Watchmen. I mean, Watchmen is just as, like I said, it's the albatross around Moore's neck as much as it is the obelisk at the center of the world of comics. It's the albatross around his neck, so he has to live with it just as much as comics does. Poor man, and I don't say that ironically. Poor man.
Yep. No, so as great as storyteller he is, and books like Jerusalem prove that when he can write his own entirety from beginning to end and have his. It's astounding and amazing, but I think when it comes to the evolution of a character, that you said it brilliantly, is part of a larger fabric of a universe that is not his. I think you have to give it to Grant Morrison every day, every minute that he has been so important to the evolution of comic characters. Even mentioning that he is a house of DC, that I just said that DC is the house that he rebuilt. That is because of how much he contributed to DC since his coming to them in the mid-2000s, and from that point forward, just running with the baton and saying, we're going to do this. And even when they try to abandon the ideas, people coming back and going, we need to go back to this.
Yeah, that's, again, something that I really appreciate about Scott Snyder, is that he's Morrison puts things out on the table and is like, guys, this is for you. I want you to have this. Do what you can with it. And Scott Snyder is one of the few writers that is like, yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah. Let's play with this. Let's see where we can go from here. Yeah, I do want to say real quick. Quick aside, yes. I am so glad you did not put who's the better prose writer on here, because Alan Moore takes that in a walk. I mean, Super Gods is great, but Jerusalem just beats it all to hell.
Well, I would have. It's so hard to tell with fiction, because autobiographical nature of Super Gods versus Jerusalem is so weird. And plus, he has a few. Moore has a few other books too, and Morrison. There's just not enough there to really compare.
It's true. But just as, neither one of us is super, super deep into Jerusalem, but we're both so completely taken by it as a novel that, as good as Super Gods is, I can't. Yeah. I can't.
No, yeah.
I can't put it over Jerusalem in any way, shape, or form.
No, Jerusalem. For anyone listening that hasn't picked up Jerusalem, if you're a fan of Alan Moore in any regard, pick it up. It is honestly,
it's astonishing.
It's the best writing he has done since Watchmen and so on. I don't mean that in insult. I mean, he literally. It is just.
It's easily the best thing he's written in 20 years.
Oh yeah, it's amazing
by a long walk.
It's incredible. Well, that means we do have to go to the tiebreaker question.
Yep. Which is, man, we always seem to end up on the tiebreaker question. I really, really, not just knowing us, but also having actually prepared for this and looked at the questions beforehand, I really thought Morrison would have had this one by now. That's why I was so shocked on question 3 when I was like, it's Alan Moore. Holy shit, Alan Moore takes this. Holy shit, we're going to the tiebreaker.
Yeah, I mean, some of these we can look at and kind of get in our head, but you never know how they're going to go because of... When you just
once the actual discussion gets started.
Yeah, when you get all the ideas on the table, you have to acknowledge things that beforehand you may not have even thought of. But that leads to our tiebreaker, which, especially with Doomsday Clock, with Young Animal, and all these things coming up, the big question that we're going to have to end on is, who has been a bigger influence on writers? And I know before anyone says anything, that's hard to quantify, but I think because of what I just mentioned in a few interviews and several things, we can at least get a good feel for it.
Right. So this is one that, again, I kind of, just because of the length and breadth and scope of his impact, I kind of have to throw this one to Alan Moore. Mostly because Jeff Johns is Jeff Johns, and Jeff Johns means what he means to DC because of Alan Moore. But then again, you could also, I mean, if we're being completely fair, I think you could actually say Scott Snyder is Scott Snyder, at least in part, due to Grant Morrison.
This is, when when I'm trying to analyze the same question we came up with, but if you're talking about influence, when you just talk about who is writing today because of that, and the people are very vocal about it. I mean, you have people. We mentioned Gerard Way already. Gerard Way may not. There's a very small chance he's been very open about it. If he had not read Doom Patrol, he may never have ended up being who he is today, and may not be writing what he's doing today. So you have an Eisner winner of this who has said several times that basically his career in comics probably wouldn't exist if not for him. You have people like Mark Millar, who is also, I mean, his influence alone is massive today with the movies, with the comics, and everything.
And Mark Miller wouldn't exist if Grant Morrison didn't exist. That's for goddamn sure.
Have people like Peter Milligan, who for a while was taken under his wing and shown how to do things. And really, even though he came to his own, they were definitely a pair for a while and helping each other. And he was very influenced and a very strong force behind him. You have people
they may or may not have dated.
Yeah, you have,
and that's from Super Gods.
Yeah, you have an endless line of people. You have people who he kind of reinvigorated to come out and do stuff. You have, where you mentioned Rebirth itself being a response, it being Jeff Johns basically saying, well, maybe this isn't. Maybe we need to go back to this way. I mean, you have Multiversity, who right now we are seeing the effects that DC appears to basically be rewriting their entire universe to match what Multiversity is. And yes, a lot of that's due to Scott Snyder's, his important place in the company. But you also see Snyder constantly tweeting nowadays about how much he loves Morrison, how much this metal run and leading up to this was influenced by him. I mean, I think several people are influenced by Watchmen. I also think Watchmen has turned off so many comic readers, and I think even there are people that love Watchmen, but they hate the destructive nature of it. And when they got to Morrison,
I definitely fall into that category at this point in my life, for sure.
And I think there are people that came back to comics and gave comics a chance and wanted to write comics again because Morrison, specifically Morrison, again, especially with the British invasion of writing and stuff, he's one of the few ones that has consistently brought that hope, brought that back, and brought comics to an evolution of what it was started to be, and for the evolution of the people reading it. And I think that influence alone is it's not hard to quantify in a way, and on the same time it's very hard to quantify, where yes, because of Watchmen, it's huge impact it is, but I don't know how much that influenced like writers of today to write or to become who they are. I mean, yes, they have definitely been that, but I do think there are people who are writing today that could care less about that. You have people like Gail Simone, especially, who could care less about Killing Joke or Watchmen or their effects, but have been very vocal about their support of people like Morrison.
Let me counter that by one point.
Yes.
And if you can refute this, then I'm more than happy to drop my more side of the argument, because you do make a really strong point. That Gail Simone, I didn't actually realize that about Gail Simone. I know she's not a fan of Killing Joke. Of course she's not. But I didn't realize that she was also vocal in her support of Grant Morrison. But so, I feel like the biggest push for this point for you is the influence on Gerard Way. And I know that's a very personal thing for you.
Partially, but I think for me, Way and Millar alone, because I think Way and Millar...
Yeah, Millar is a really good counterpoint to that.
But I think not only them, but my point being how much they have influenced comics culture themselves because of him. It's that tentacle effect of...
Right,
and not only
but again,
comics, but movies.
I have to point out...
Yes.
Doomsday Clock.
Yes, Doomsday Clock.
Just the anticipation of Doomsday Clock versus the 10,000 unit sales that Doom Patrol gets. And I'm not trying to say that as an insult. I'm just trying, I'm saying that as looking at the sales charts, looking purely at what is moving on the shelves in the marketplace and what is not. The pre-orders for Doomsday Clock are magnitudes above what Doomsday Clock, or what Doom Patrol is selling. Mark Miller is not moving the numbers that he used to, even though his movies are, still doing great. Kingsman 2 apparently made a fuck ton of money, which is great. Yeah. I loved it. It was wonderful. But I feel like Mark Miller's influence on comics has faded, but the obelisk that is Watchmen continues to move along and move apace. And as much as Jeff Johns wrote Rebirth in a maybe may or may not have been influenced by the let's try a different, better, non-Watchmen-y way.
Yeah.
He's right. Doomsday Clock, man.
Well, I think for me, my big argument for that is the reason why Before Watchmen failed utterly. And
right. And it did.
And like became what the travesty was is because it was giving people what they thought they wanted. They thought they wanted Watchmen. They thought they wanted Watchmen again. So they just be like, okay, here's Watchmen. It didn't sell what it was supposed to. It didn't sell good. I think the reason Doomsday Clock is doing what it is because of you taking Watchmen and reworking it into comics to where it's not... instead of it becoming a deconstruction of comics and trying to use it to a point to reconstruct comics and remake what it broke. I mean, there are several, even in Rebirth, there are several things talking about what Watchmen... hinting more so, I mean, to the point where it first came out, a lot of people talking about, like, it is basically just saying Alan Moore is responsible for everything wrong in comics.
Right.
And so I think my big...
Which I think was a bit of a... Looking back, that was a bit of an overreaction. But at the time, it definitely made sense.
But I think for Doomsday Clock, I don't think the excitement is because of... I don't think the excitement is so much of, oh, this is an Alan Moore-influenced work of Watchmen. I think it's almost reversed. I think it's, oh, this is taking these characters from this very famous book and seeing them in a completely new light. I think it may honestly be the complete reverse of Alan Moore's influence, is taking them and seeing how can we rework it to a point where it's not showing Alan Moore anymore. And that could be good or bad. Whatever that take, but it does appear to be that way. I mean, we're seeing more and more almost the literal fight between Morrison and Moore, where it's looking to be a very Morrison-esque Superman versus a very Moore-esque Dr. Manhattan. Yet the world around it is, again, because of Rebirth, is supposed to be a Morrison-influenced world.
And I do feel like, to kind of back up your point, I feel like a lot of the current DC establishment writers, and the reason I say DC is because I feel like Marvel is so much the house that Bendis built at this point that Marvel doesn't really have a dog in this particular fight. But a lot of the current DC writers that are really bringing the titles that people are really reading, stuff like, Peter Tomasi's Superman is the one that comes immediately to mind. They are, again, and part of it is the Rebirth mandate, but part of it is they are playing off of the Morrison conception of the character. I feel like Superdad is very much a natural extension of what Morrison was playing with in All-Star Superman.
I think, honestly, we missed the big comparison is we were talking about Doom Patrol versus it, but we also mentioned Scott Snyder's influence specifically on metal, and look at what metal is selling. And we know that is a directly Morrison-influenced to be more like Morrison way, and what the numbers that is selling.
Not just Multiversity, but Final Crisis, which at the time was critically and fan-panned, but I think has really come around in a lot of people's estimation. I think you turned me on this one, man. I really thought Moore was going to walk away with this one, but I think you're right. I think again, it comes down to what we're talking about, arguing about in question number 3. Do we look at the creator of that Watchmen created, this incredible impact zone that Watchmen created, or do we look at what's going on right now? And Moore influenced a ton of writers and creators in the 1980s and 1990s, but Morrison continues to influence creators who are working in comics today. And I think you're right. I think that's actually the division point that we need to look at. Moore had his day, and Moore's impact influenced a ton of writers, but Morrison keeps influencing writers.
Yeah, I mean, I say that we've said a lot of similar names because the impact level of the names he has influenced alone is huge. Where, yes, Alan Moore has influenced people like Jeff Johns, but I do think even if you were to talk to Jeff Johns today, I don't know if he would be, if that's the first name he comes up to, it's like, why are you writing the way you're writing?
Okay. One more thing I want to point out, just to gauge your temperature on this. Yeah. When we talk about influencing writers, are we also talking about influencing them in a "but I don't want to do that"? Because again, going back to the Reconstructionist pre-Morrison, when you had people like Kurt Busiek and Mark Waid and people who were actively fighting against the darkening deconstructioning of comics, you could argue that Moore influenced them as well, but influenced them in a that's not what I want comics to be. I'm going to actively write against that grain.
It's an interesting point. I think the only problem with that is you end up that very unquantifiable thing, because then you also have the reverse of that is how many people, the writers that were influenced by Moore that really enjoyed Watchmen and then read stuff like Morrison and then specifically wanted to write stuff that wasn't like Morrison. But
okay, fair enough.
I also think, well, what we could quantify is those artists and writers are much harder to name. So, and there's a few and far between, so as far as who had a bigger influence, I don't think those people lasted long.
Interesting point. I can get behind that. That was one more thing. It just kind of tracked into my head. I was like, if we talk influence, we also have to talk about counter influence and how Mark Waid's Flash and Kurt Busiek's Astro City were very pointedly anti-Watchmen works.
Yeah,
and anti-deconstructionist works. And
there comes a point where, yes, and you can't argue the good versus influence versus bad influence. But I think in this question specifically, you have to ask, if this...
Well, it ultimately comes down to who is still influencing.
Yeah, exactly. That's the big point.
Morrison
is still, to this day, there are people who are writing their first comics and who are huge Morrison fans and are writing because of something they read in a Morrison book. There are people, and again, that very unquantifiable thing, but then you have the vast amount of people that have been influenced by the Scott Snyders, especially Gerard Way with music and everything else, that are directly tied to Morrison. That, I mean, it's so impossible.
Morrison godfathers in influence in a way that again it goes back to the albatross of Watchmen around Moore's neck. You can point to Moore and be like, yes, Moore influenced this, and this, but I don't feel like Moore really godfathered any creators in a way that, like you say, someone influenced by Gerard Way is in their own way influenced by Grant Morrison.
Well, crap! I'm a living testament of that. I would not have known about Grant Morrison for one for Gerard Way, but also because of that, I don't know if I would have read much Alan Moore. Period, if it wasn't for Gerard Way knowing about Grant Morrison and then just happening to see his name because of how big his name was. So it does go back to, it's a weird ladder, and it's hard. Again, I keep saying it's hard to quantify, but it's really, I don't even know if it is, because if you look at the modern comics universe, the fingerprints of Grant Morrison now are becoming more and more and more clear, while what Alan Moore once, was the king of, and once everyone said you could constantly see Moore's influence is slowly fading away. And I think the deconstructive period of comics that he started, I think it ended probably almost a decade ago, and now we're seeing the results of this reconstructionist movement that Morrison has very much been the spearhead of.
And it's unfortunate that Alan Moore is associated with this one big, not just this one big project, it's not just Watchmen, but also with the movement that followed, and that he couldn't escape the shape of it and the shadow of it. It's very much the George Lucas syndrome. You're absolutely right. He is a different person because of Watchmen, and his career took a different trajectory. His writing took a different trajectory. He changed comics, but comics changed him. For better and for worse, and unfortunately, in Moore's case, probably mostly for worse. And it's a tragedy that we didn't get to see the Alan Moore post Watchmen that could have been, and that may be ultimately what loses him this collision, is that Morrison. And, we kind of talked on our last podcast, Invisibles versus Watchmen, as far as definitive works of a creator, and Invisibles did have its diehards, and Invisibles did change comics in certain ways, but nowhere near the scope and definitiveness of Watchmen to the point where it broke Morrison as a creator. And I feel like Watchmen may have broke Moore as a creator. Yeah. And
I mean,
and unfortunately it kind of froze him in an amber of who he is and what he could do.
Yeah, I think a book like Jerusalem, I don't think, as amazing as it was, I think we're just now getting to a point where we can have a book like that and look at it for what it is without comparing it to Watchmen, without comparing it to even them being such different literary things. I mean, the impact of Watchmen is, again, with the exception of possibly Dark Knight Returns, it's immeasurable. And yet, I think it's the constant influence, the constant motion that Morrison has worked, the constant rebuilding, the constant thing. It's just that it's the one big punch versus 1,000 little ones. But eventually, he just keeps on coming and doesn't stop, and keeps on hitting big hits. I mean, again, we're losing out. We're talking about all the stuff that he's done. We're also forgetting to mention stuff like, Happy's getting adapted to a TV show. You have more Morrison coming out. You have more of this. You have Morrison movies. You have all stuff that's starting to happen, and you're starting to see his influence in films and everything else. More, you were seeing his influence fade. You were seeing his stuff slowly fade away, and even stuff like Doomsday Clock could radically change how we look at Watchmen.
Right.
So it's an interesting time for this fight to happen. It's probably honestly better now.
Yeah, for sure.
But I'm
glad we did it when we did it. Yeah.
I think the fact that we have to keep on bringing up a book that Morrison's not, or that Moore's not writing, and one that just happens to have characters that he was famous for,
adapted and popularized. Yeah.
I think that really might tell about where he is and where Morrison is. Especially if we're comparing them today and what they represent today.
Yeah.
So I think if we're going to talk about Moore versus Morrison, I think Morrison has to win.
I think so. Holy shit, man.
Yeah,
you did it.
It happened.
I guess, on the one hand, big surprise, Grant Morrison walks away with the win. But much like when we did our Morrison versus Gaiman, it was kind of touch and go there.
Yeah.
Like there were some times where I was like, holy shit, Moore might pull this one out. Your impassioned defense of question number 5, I think, ultimately won me over, because I walked into that question thinking Moore had that. But you're absolutely right. Comparing past work versus current work and potential future work, I think Morrison takes it. So, Congratulations to Grant Morrison, patron saint of the Blah Blah Comics Blah Blah Curse Word podcast. You have once again
come on the show and accept your trophy.
I'm so sorry?
I said come on the show and accept your trophy.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
This has been a delight.
Yes.
This was so much fun. I was definitely a little scared of this one going in, but I feel like we both made salient, cogent points. I feel like we argued to the best of our ability, and I feel like we really tried to bring as little of our personal taste and experiences to the door. I feel like we tried to be as objective as possible, and I hope all of you listening got that vibe as well. I genuinely do. If you don't think so, please let us know. We would love to hear your thoughts about this particular collision. Shoot us an email. Tell us how we're wrong. As take as much time as you need. Yeah. Our email is blahblahcomics@gmail.com. I keep cutting you off, man. What are you trying to say?
Oh no, I was just saying I was agreeing with you.
Okay.
I said, yeah.
I just felt like I was cutting you off. I hate it when I do that. I tend to ramble. So.
But yeah, no, I was gonna say I will add that if you're watching this on the Doom Club YouTube, you're watching this on the Night Nerd YouTube, make sure to check out and subscribe to the Night Nerd YouTube channel, to the Night Nerd Facebook, to Night Nerd on Instagram, Night Nerd on Twitter, on top of all our blah blah stuff we're about to mention. But make sure to do that, because we'll be posting more and more there.
Yeah, we're trying to incorporate the Night Nerd better and make it all of one big brand, because we are a part of the Night Nerd Network, and we are extremely proud to be a part of the Night Nerd Network. Our producer Lance is an incredibly great guy. He's given us a lot of autonomy and lets us play around and subs in on our podcast when one or the other of us can't work. It's really a great working relationship and a great friendship we have with this guy. We can't say enough good about him. So subscribe to all the Night Nerd stuff. He's got his own daily show that he does every single day for you guys. It's a lot of fun. The Night Nerd. You can find him on Facebook on the Night Nerd. You can find us on Facebook, Blah Blah Comics, Facebook.com/Blah Blah Podcast. Excuse me. We're on Twitter. We are at Blah Blah Podcast on Twitter. We're also individually on Twitter. I post a lot more on mine at Voodoo Ben.
I'm at Hellhound F5.
And at Hellhound F5 gets all kinds of celebrity likes and retweets, because Colby really knows how to talk to people and I don't. So
I get lucky sometimes.
His is the one to follow for sure. But yeah, seriously, thank you so much for letting us do this. This was such a blast. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. We enjoyed recording it. Please do like, comment, share, subscribe. Tell us what you think. Tell us how we're wrong. Tell us what you agree with. We want to know. We're more than happy to continue this conversation. And well, actually, this is if you've never really listened to Blah Blah before, we do stuff like this every week. Normally, we're just a comics and pop culture podcast. Sometimes we go off and do collision tangents and other things. Next week, we have most likely a Family Sounds, which is a group podcast with our producer Lance. We may also do a special Halloween themed episode. We've been talking about doing one for ages. So that might end up showing up on the network as well next week. So you might get a double dose of the Blah guys with Lance the Night Nerd in tow. So take a look out for that on SoundCloud. We're on iTunes. We're on 2 YouTube channels, the Doom Club YouTube and the Night Nerd YouTube. So you can check us out there as well. So many places to find us and listen to us. And we couldn't do it without you guys. So this has been awesome.
Well,
Colby, thank you so much, man.
No problem. Thank you. And I do want to say, I think this officially ends a very long, very tumultuous, and very randomly paced first season of Comics Collisions.
Yes. Hopefully looking forward to doing more in the future. I feel like the next one we should do is we really need to sit down and tackle a couple of artists, because they have been very writer heavy.
Maybe that's the difference. Maybe season 2 is focus on the artist.
I'm okay with that. And then, of course, for those of you longtime Blah Blah listeners, you all know that my pet project, my passion collision, is going to be Dave Sim versus Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird. We have a potential guest host lined up for that still. He has expressed interest, but then shortly after he expressed interest, he moved to another state. So that's still kind of up in the air. I tell you what, though, if you are a listener to Blah Blah Comics, Blah Blah Curse Words, and you are a fan of Dave Sim or Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, or like me, you find things to like about both sets of work, let us know. We might actually have you on as a guest arguer for a Comics Collision, because I really want to do this, guys. Colby would adjudicate, and then you and I would discuss the collision and ultimately try to figure out a winner. So yeah, there's that as well. Get in contact with us over that if you're interested. Okay, I'm going to finally shut this down. I'll stop talking now. Thank you all so much for listening. You're the best. Colby, you're the best.
Thank you.
We will see each and every one of you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye and good night. Night.